Welcome to this event called Changing Landscapes, the Media, Brexit and China. My name is Lucien. I'm a host on CGTN of a program called The Point with Lucien. It's on Monday through Friday, 1:30 to 2 GMT.
She got her plug in right away. My name is Mike Walter. I'm from Washington, D.C., and Lucien flew in from Beijing. I flew in from Washington, D.C., so we're two things. We're jet lagged, but we're also very excited to be here for this rather unique, unusual event today.
Absolutely, and we would like to thank you for making your way here today in this very special, beautiful Saturday afternoon. Thank you very much for making your time here. So two things we want to do today. First of all, to introduce to you a brand new media presence here in London, right? And secondly, we want to discuss some pretty important subjects that are important to us and I hope would also resonate with you as people in the UK. The Brexit, UK's relationship with China at a very critical moment. So for those of you who are not very familiar with CGTN, I think it would be worthwhile to talk a little bit about what CGTN really is. So actually CGTN is the rebranding of the English language service of CCTV, which came into being as early as September 2000. But on the last day of 2016, CGTN was born, and it stands for China Global TV Network. Actually, there are 6 foreign languages channels, a media content agency, and a new media group. I just want to give you a little bit of a few numbers as to what we have done so far since 1.5 years we've been on air. We are reaching over 200 million viewers in 133 countries and regions around the world. And in terms of new media followers, I think we have done particularly well. For CGTN English, globally, we have 86 million active users. And the CGTN English Facebook page is the world's #1 news media account among all news media accounts in the world. That's pretty impressive.
It's very, very impressive in a very short period of time. And of course, it's worth noting that Lucien works in Beijing, one of our production facilities there. I'm in Washington, D.C., but we have a third in Nairobi. And as many of you probably are well aware, since you're here today, we're going to have a fantastic new site. In fact, we had an opportunity to view it out in Chiswick Park yesterday. And it's going to be a state-of-the-art facility, and it's coming soon, and we're really excited about it.
Absolutely, and we hope that by the end of this year, the Chiswick Park Production Center will go into operation, and I hope many of you will have the opportunity to join our big family. So in our engagement with TV viewers as well as news media users, we have been following some very amazing development, and we are all aware of these very important changes in the world. For instance, the trade friction between China and the United States, and possibly between Europe and the United States.
Just about everybody in the United States. My daughter's having issues with the United States. It's crazy. Yeah.
So how is that going to affect us? How is that going to affect people here in the UK? And where are the relationship going? And how have the media been covering these events superficially, in depth, fairly, or from different perspectives? These are the things we want to talk about this afternoon.
Yeah, and we've got a lot of questions. You know, what does Britain's withdrawal mean for Europe and all of the relationships between the UK and Europe, and of course China? How does it engage with Europe and Britain with Brexit? And of course it's very much top of mind today. I'm sure many of you watched the news coverage before coming here. I did. These protest marches that are going on today.
Absolutely, a fantastic background context to our discussion today. So 3 parts, I think, what we're going to do. First, a keynote speech, and then followed by a panel discussion. After that, you will be able to have a free communication with any of the panelists or any of the guests here present today about the questions you might have following all the discussion, right?
It's going to be fantastic.
I hope so. So let us introduce to you our keynote speaker. He has been a long-time writer on China and on its relationship with the UK. Mr. Martin Jacques has had decades of experience as a columnist for publications such as the Sunday Times, The Guardian, The New Statesman, among others. He's author of the 2009 global bestseller, When China Rules the World, which has been translated into 16 different languages and has been nominated for 2 literary awards. And he's also subject of a popular TED Talk, Understanding the Rise of China, which have drawn 2.6 million views. So ladies and gentlemen, let's put our hands together to welcome Mr. Jacques.
Well, thank you very much, Lucien, for those kind words, and it's nice to see you in London, Mike. I've never seen you in London. This is quite a task, actually, to try and respond to the brief, which has sort of just been outlined. I mean, here we are at the 11th hour. We're nearly there, and we actually don't know what's going to happen. Because in reality, there are so many possibilities still open. If you press me, I would say probably the 2 most likely assumptions are firstly that Britain will leave the European Union. I'm not stating my own view here, I'm just saying what I think is going to happen. And secondly, some kind of customs union will be followed, at least for quite a long period, between Britain and the European Union. But I want to emphasize that, you know, other things could happen. I mean, we don't actually know what Britain's position is going to be in the final negotiations with the European Union. We don't know how the European Union is going to respond to this. One thing I think that I would underline is this has not been Britain's finest hour. This has been such a mess. This is the worst exercise in governance, not just in my memory, but at least for a century. Extraordinary inability of the country to move forward. The society is divided. The political parties are divided. No one, in very fundamental ways. So I think that in a way the best example of this, if I could say this, the best example of this is why didn't those who were in favour of Brexit do any serious work on what the implications of Brexit were going to be? Because it's patently clear that they didn't. The whole referendum campaign, the build-up to it and so on, I mean, it was a long period, was conducted in terms of rhetoric. There'd be no serious preparation and no serious planning, which is why, you know, we don't know what's going to happen. Now, there was a kernel of an important idea, in my view, in their position, and that was that it is true indeed that the European market is a pretty static market, growing very slowly, and that the expanding markets of the world are outside the European Union. So I listened carefully during the campaign to which countries they had in mind. I remember the first one got mentioned was Australia. Well, that's not serious. I mean, if you're Australian, it's serious, Australia, but it's a small, very small market. And then the Commonwealth. Well, that's not really, that's a generality. India got an occasional mention. Of course, America, I always think that America was much more important than actually was articulated. And then occasionally, very, very occasionally, China got mentioned. So the idea of global Britain, you know, in the context of these markets and where Britain was going to move and how what kind of relationship it was going to develop, remained, I think, most opaque, most unclear, most unworked out. Now, the reality of the situation is, in my view, extremely simple. If Britain is going to leave the European Union, or indeed if it stays in the European Union, there is one market, one economy that is absolutely crucial to the future of the UK, and that is China. Now, let's just remind ourselves of a little bit of history very quickly. 1980, the Chinese economy was 1/20th of the size of the American economy. 2014, 2014, World Bank International Comparison Program, the Chinese economy overtook the American economy in terms of gross domestic product measured by purchasing power parity. It is now, according to the IMF, a bit under 20% larger than the American economy by this measure. But let's raise our horizons, time horizons. This is 2030. Now, these are always tricky things. You know, they're projections of the future. But actually, they've often been pretty good. And this is a projection of the global economy in 2030. China, a third of the global economy. Over twice the size of the American economy. Bigger than the American economy and the European Union put together. By far the largest market in the world. So, and, you know, of course, there's been some certain amount of skepticism about whether China can keep the dynamic of its growth up and so on, and the Chinese have been addressing the question of shifting the paradigm of their economic growth from one which was dependent essentially on cheap labour and quite low levels of capital, to one which is much more linked to R&D, value-added production, services, and so on. And actually, the reality, in my view, I mean, I thought that China would have a difficult problem making this transition, but actually I think the reality is that China is, not on every front, but on key fronts, is doing extraordinarily well. I mean, I think historically this is a very dynamic. I don't think we really understand the Chinese economy. I think that its sources of growth, its sources of dynamism are historically very deep. And so, for example, let me take the tech industry. You know, I mean, China did not have really a serious tech firm until quite recently. These are the 6 largest tech firms, firms in the world, and you'll see four of them in America, and 2 of them, Alibaba and Tencent, are Chinese. But I think this is even more. The next one is even more revealing. I took this off a tweet actually, and these are the 20 largest tech firms in the world. Just note there is not a single European firm on this list. Now, in 2013, 18 of the largest tech firms in the world were American, and 2 were Chinese. Now, these figures, which are about a month or 2 old, there are now 11 American firms and 9 Chinese firms. I mean, that is an extraordinary rate of change. So, and of course, there is now widespread recognition. I mean, I go to Silicon Valley occasionally because my son's at Stanford at the moment. And, you know, the people there will say, you know, in certain areas now, China is in advance of the United States, in mobile technology in particular, and so on. So, of course, now we're facing, so what's the effect of a tariff war going to be? Now, I have felt, ever since the primary election, Republican primaries in America in early 2016, that there would be a trade war. That was my view. I know there were a lot of people who didn't think that, but I think there is going to be a trade war. I don't know how long it's going to go on for. I don't know how severe it's going to be, but it's going to happen. And it's going to have a very negative effect on the American economy, on the Chinese economy for sure, on the global economy, on the UK economy. There's no question about that. It's going to do damage. How much damage depends on how long and how severe it goes on for. But for those in the Trump administration who are motivated by the idea that somehow a trade war will stop the rise of China or reverse the rise of China, are living in cloud cuckoo land. Because the economy of the two that is going to be most hurt by the trade war is the United States. Because China is the growing, rising, transforming, dynamic economy. And America has lots of problems, lots of problems. It is, in my view, in all sorts of ways, a declining economy, a culture which has peaked and is in decline. Of course, all these things are in a relative context. Now, having said all that, let's just also remember that the impact of China's economic rise has been and is being the transformation, not just of China or even East Asia, but the world. I love this map by Danny Kwa, who used to be a professor at LSE, he's now gone to Lee Kuan Yew School, because it tells us historically just how the world is changing. Danny placed essentially this is an exercise in trying to establish where the centre of the global economy is. So Danny places it in 1980, you'll see in the Atlantic, in the Eastern Atlantic, which is fair enough. I mean, in that period, the global economy is essentially a transatlantic economy. But as time's gone by, it's moved progressively eastwards. And now he thinks it's somewhere about here, just above the Arabian Peninsula, and just to the right of the dot above there. And he thinks by 2050 it will be on the Indian-Chinese border. In other words, essentially, goodbye a Western-centric economy. Goodbye a transatlantic economy. Hello, a Eurasian economy, a Eurasian-centric economy. That is the great historical shift of our time, with consequences for every country and every economy in the world. And of course, China, in its Belt and Road, it's a map of the various routes and so on, in its Belt and Road, is seeking to transform in an active way, in a proactive way, the present situation of the Eurasian economy by using, I would suggest, its own experience, the lessons of its own experience, that its economic growth has essentially been achieved by very high levels of investment, first and foremost in infrastructure, as a way in which the Eurasian landmass, where there are many poor countries, a very significant number of landlocked countries, themselves can be economically transformed. Now, at first, the West more or less ignored it, actually. But of course, you know, things are moving, and people are shifting, and businesses in particular are shifting, and governments are shifting around the world, but particularly in this region, there's very, very big support. Well over 100 countries are involved in Belt and Road. And Belt and Road, in my view, it's going to take a long time, but Belt is going to be fundamentally successful. And in so doing, it will transform the largest landmass in the world, and it will transform, as a result, both the global economy and the global polity. Now, having said all that, let me go back to Britain and Brexit. Now, when Brexit first happened 2 years ago, of course there was great interest. I mean, Britain was completely convulsed by it, but European Union, I remember in China, much discussion in China about it, and around the world. Now, 2 years on, I don't think it's quite the same. I mean, we're still totally obsessed with it here. But I don't think Europe is totally obsessed by it in the way they were before, because Europe has other things on its mind. And the rest of the world has other things on its mind. And what is on its mind is that whereas Brexit at the time was a sort of breakup of part of the post-war order, what has happened since then is a much bigger fragmentation of the global order consequent on the election of Trump as President of the United States. And his clear determination, despite many people, naysayers, his determination to change America's relationship, not just with a semi-adversary, maybe call it that, like China, but also with its traditional allies, and to remake the world in a new kind of America first or America-centric image. Now this, it seems to me, you see, the British have really depended, I think, in the back of their minds, or a large section of British opinion, and I think European opinion, but Britain especially probably, have depended on the idea that, you know, the special relationship, the relationship with the United States is forever. But we can't do it anymore, because we can't really trust the old situation, the old continuities to continue, because they are clearly in the process of erosion and fracture. So this is why I think this is something that adds great importance to Britain's relationship with China, because if it cannot depend on the United States in the same way as it did before, as the kind of default, and many of the Brexiteers depended on as a default mode in preference to Europe, but that is no longer there in the same way. I'm not saying they can reject it or walk away from it, but you can't rely on it anymore like we did before. Now, having said that, you know the British have got two problems. The first problem, well, we've probably got more than two problems, but this is for the time being. The first problem is, you know, we see the world in such a Western-centric way. You know, how many times do you switch on the Today programme, or, you know, in the mornings as I do, and get annoyed, or you hear politicians say, the international community. When actually, when they're talking about the international community, they don't mean an international community at all. All they mean is the West. The West is seen as coterminous with, as synonymous with, the international community. Excuse me, but only 15% of the world's population lives in the West. The West is only responsible for 30% of global GDP. This is backward thinking. We're not addressing the world as it is and the world as it's becoming. We're addressing the world as it was. So how can we relate to the world if we've got that kind of, we're always looking in the rearview mirror? It doesn't work. The other problem we have is our attitude to China. Now, I think there's been a significant movement amongst, broadly speaking, in the British population in their attitude towards China. I think it's come along in certain respects because, you know, I mean, China's rising, old attitudes, you know, China's not going to make it, it's going to have a big economic crisis. It didn't happen in China, it happened in the West. China's going to have a dirty, great big political crisis because the political system is unsustainable. Whoops! Well, it's still doing very well, and the political crisis happened in the West instead. So it's difficult to sustain old positions in that situation. And I think a lot of people on the left and the right, actually, have shifted significantly. But there is still an underlying problem, I think, in British attitudes, and it's also more true generally of Western attitudes towards China. Basically, the mentality, I think, broadly speaking, is still China should be like us. We insist on measuring China according to our values. We project on China our values. We require China to be like this. We lecture China about the need to be like us. You know, this really won't do. This is really unacceptable. Because China is different. It's always been different. It will continue to be different. It is a fundamentally different construct to the way in which Western countries historically have been shaped and developed. I mean, China is really a continent. The relationship between state and society in China and the individual is very different from the Western tradition. Anyone who knows anything about China, and suck it and see. It is very different. It's not something. It's not government propaganda. It's a reality. Or take governance. I mean, we've been so dismissive of Chinese governments. Actually, I think China's got the most competent governance in the world. I think China is, historically speaking, probably the home of statecraft. What other government could have transformed their country of 1.3, 1.4 billion people in the way that China has done? And finally, China is not even really, in my view, in my book, for example, primarily a nation state. China is a civilization state, and only secondarily a nation state. But if you're talking to a Western audience, including a British audience, most people will look at you askance. What do you mean, a civilization state? Yeah, welcome to the new world, where there is a much greater variety than we have previously entertained, because we've expected everyone to be like us. Now, these are the kind of changes of mindset, firstly in terms of Western centrism, and secondly in terms of our conception of China, that Britain needs to go through to live properly in the world as it is evolving and as it is developing. And the more able we are to make that shift in our thinking, the better our relationship with China will be. And we need a different kind of relationship with China. Now, I'll come to this in a moment. We've made some serious steps in this direction, in my view. We have made some serious steps in this direction. And I went to a conference, actually. I keep telling people, but I went to a conference. It was so good. I couldn't believe my ears. And I'm a realist. And it was organised by the Centre for Policy Studies. It was at the Guildhall. Centre for Policy Studies, I don't know, was Thatcher's old think tank. It's a big event, 700-800 people. And it was music to my ears, because it was essentially a conservative right-wing group of people. And they were so positive about China. They were so open-minded about China. Not everyone. There were people who were more negative, but the general tenor, the general tone of the event was extremely positive. That we need a new kind of relationship with China. We can build a new relationship with China. We cannot rely on the world as it's been in the past. We cannot rely on our relationship with America as we have. I mean, that was the nature. So I think that there was real movement in the population and potentially rapid movement. Now, so we need to build Britain, with everything I've said, Britain's post-Brexit relationship crucially rests on its relationship, in my view, with China. If we don't seize that opportunity, then we'll be in a much more negative situation. Now, just to finish, I mean, it should be remembered that Britain is the major destiny of Chinese foreign investment in the context of Europe over the last 2000 to 2016. But the stronger point I want to make is this. One of the best things any British government has done over the post-war decades, and one of the most courageous things a British government has done, was the Cameron-Osborne government's decision to join the Asian Infrastructure Bank. I mean, you've got to remember, this was done against the objection of the United States. I mean, as far as I can see, the only other major way in which I may be wrong about this, but the only one I can remember was Wilson refused to send troops, British troops, in the Vietnam War, but we still supported the Americans in the Vietnam War. But this was a very brave decision, in my view. Now, the composition of the Asian Infrastructure Investments Bank was those 22 countries when it was first announced in, if I remember correctly, October 2014. Then Britain decided to join the European, the AIB, and the impact was enormous. I mean, Britain's decision then persuaded a lot of European countries to join and other countries around the world, and the institution was transformed. So this was this showed you what the possibilities might be for Britain if it chose a different role in the world, if it chose to be more independent-minded, if it chose to be closer to China in terms of future policy, future orientation, future trade, and so on, and institution building. So I leave you with this thought. This example should be an indication of how future British policy should be conceived. The post-Brexit future for Britain lies in its relationship with China. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Jacques. Please take the second seat. Yeah, thank you. That was, it's not the first time that I hear Mr. Jacques speak, but every time I hear his speech, I always find out a bit more about China, about, especially this time, the prospects of the UK. So let's have a discussion and dive into some of the points that Mr. Jacques pointed out. Let us welcome our distinguished panelists, and let me introduce them to you one by one. Dr. Yu Jie, who is teaching at the London School of Economics and the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. She also leads the China Foresight Project at LSE Ideas. Please welcome. Mr. Stephen Perry, who heads the 48 Group, a UK organisation that's been dedicated to opening up trade and promoting understanding between China and the UK since 1953. Mr. Perry. And last but not least, Vivian Marsh from the University of Westminster, who spent more than 25 years at the BBC, part of that time just across the street from where we are this afternoon. And she has just finished her PhD study at the university on comparing the media in China and the UK. So welcome to Ms. Marsh as well. So, very interesting period of time, and basically at this moment I believe we have some protesters outside near the building, I guess. So I really want to ask this question, and I would like to ask the first question to Dr. Yu, please. Okay. 2 years ago on this day the referendum was held, and today, as Mr. Jacques pointed out, you are still in kind of a mess and not understanding where you are going. So is it too early to think about the UK's relationship in the post-Brexit era? And do you think enough attention is being given to that aspect of the Brexit, if it happens at all?
Well, I mean, for your question, there's no such a clear answer as such, because we don't really know. This is for the first time you have such a divorce bill historically between the two economic entities. And what I'm concerned in here is the current British government not have enough capacity to develop some kind of relations with non-European countries, because they're so much occupied in busying trying to work out what is a Brexit plan they should have. I mean, what the earth is going on after 2 years? I have no idea what is going on with the number 10. So that perhaps if we're talking about accountability for the government, I think Theresa May should perhaps provide a clear answer in here. But outside of UK-China relations, I don't necessarily think so. It's too early to talk about it now. But I mean, as the Chinese are always arguing, if there's a crisis, and there must be an opportunity in here as well. So the three things I think that China were asking for the British government. Firstly,
we're going to talk about that in just a moment.
Sure, that's fine. Okay.
But Mr. Perry, let me come to you. You have been in trade, and last year we've seen some very exciting numbers, right? The trade between China and the UK reached 67.5 billion. That's an increase of 14% year on year. And really exciting news is China has been importing 1/3 more British service and products. What are the factors that have driven trade in such a direction and speed?
I think it's been a decision by China to recognise the historical and strategic importance of the United Kingdom. I think that comes partly from both being on the Security Council and the importance that the Security Council has in international relations. But I think it goes beyond that. I think the London as a financial centre is very important. The renminbi, which today accounts for 2 to 3% of world reserves, probably going towards 20–25% over the next 10, 15, 20 years. And London plays an important part in the circulation of funds. The openness of the British economy to investment overseas is very important to China. And the preparedness of the British to look again at how they position themselves in world trade. I think the points Martin was making earlier on, absolutely crucial. The British have got to make a choice and the Chinese are helping them make it.
But was it because of the Brexit prospect that business people in the UK and business people in China are doing more trade among themselves?
I have to say that I think that the first pressures to increase the trade substantially were because I think both sides thought Britain would stay inside the European Union. I think the decision of the referendum was a surprise to most people in Britain and also to most people internationally. Now, China has had something approaching 2 years to look at and think through what are the possible alternatives. And I've been intrigued by the number of Chinese delegations that have come to London asking, what do you think will be the consequences? And being surprised at the blank faces that meet them. But if you take Martin's point, and I think he expressed this very well, the post-Brexit situation is going to be an opportunity for China. You expressed that very well. China's adept at looking to see how it can take advantage of a crisis. We will have a crisis, but that will give China the opportunity to speed up its process of working out a positive and golden relationship with the United Kingdom.
Okay, Ms. Marsh, let me come to you. 2 years on, we still have some large-scale demonstrations, and people are talking about we should have a second, or you should have a second referendum on whether to leave Europe or not. What is your view on the future of Brexit? Do you think that's possible at all? It's just some people's wishful thinking.
No, well, I'm vehemently anti-Brexit myself, but you know, I think it is still a possibility. There could still be a vote, but I do think that the UK domestic political broadcasting media have not exactly covered themselves in glory with this, and they haven't really sketched out this possibility.
What do you think, however, that's going to do to the future relationship between China and the UK? Now that, you know, you are still coming back and forth on whether or not you're going to leave Europe, is that going to affect things some way?
Well, I think, you know, my impression is that Britain needs to see itself in a different light now. If it goes it alone, if it falls off the cliff edge and goes it alone afterwards, it is going to China in the role of a supplicant. It's not going as a member of a big trading bloc anymore. And the balance has actually changed in that equation, that China is in a position of great power if Britain leaves itself exposed. And I think this is why there is so much opposition to Brexit from a lot of quarters.
Well, there are also opportunities lying in there, right? I mean, Mr. Jacques, how do you pick up from what Ms. Marsh just mentioned about challenges after the UK leaves Europe?
Well, I think that I agree virtually with everything that's been said, actually. I mean, I think that leaving the European Union leaves Britain very exposed, isolated. I think, you know, the American option doesn't look so strong as 2 years ago, before Trump really got going. So, you know, where is Britain going to turn in this situation? So I think that's probably why ultimately there'll be some kind of deal with Europe in terms of customs union and so on. But that's not going to really, you know, I mean, Britain's not part of it anymore. I mean, you know, we're getting carved out of, quite understandably by the European Union, carved out of things already. Galileo program and so on, Airbus is the latest thing and so on. This is all happening quite quickly, and I think this is just the beginning. So it does, you're right, that it does leave Britain in a weak situation, and I think that's why I think there will be a growing willingness to look at China in a different way, because China can offer the UK in this situation quite a lot. But, you know, of course you're right. You're right that Britain will be in a relatively weak situation vis-a-vis China in that situation. I mean, you know, if you look at the countries that China's trading with across East Asia and so on, some are in, you know, the weaker ones can't drive sort of a good bargain with China as the stronger ones, and we'll be in that situation. But I don't think that's we should be worrying too much about that at the moment, because I think, you know, that lies in the future. And you know, I'd welcome the situation where we have to start thinking in those terms, because I think that would be, you know, this would be such a reinvention of Britain to be thinking in these terms.
Well, you were talking about the possibility that China, or a stronger relationship with China, is going to open up to the UK, and yet China is not at the fore, let's say, in the media landscape or at the domestic discourse. What is the problem? Why are people kind of avoiding this topic? Do you think people do not want to talk about it, people are not interested, or people just don't see it the way you see it?
China?
Yes, here in the UK.
You know, I think that the mentality in Britain is not so different from that in the rest of Europe. I mean, you know, you take Germany. Germany's got the best relationship, certainly economically, with China of any country in the European Union. But probably German sort of antipathy towards China is stronger than maybe most other European countries. So it's a deep question. You know, it's not. It's partly a Cold War. So partly a function of the Cold War, and the idea that, you know, anything ruled by a Communist Party is, well, we know what that's like. Well, actually, you don't know what it's like, because it's so different from the Soviet Union and all that kind of thing, and its record has been so different. And it's also, and this is very important, it's a cultural historical factor. You know, it's not just about China. What do we know about developing countries in general? You know, what do we know about the needs of developing countries? What do we know about how to develop countries? I think Britain is, you know, Britain's not got a clue. I mean, if I can just say this. You know, John Humphreys on the Today programme, you won't know this, but look, the audience, he was dealing with Rwanda. Did you hear the one? He was interviewing someone for Rwanda, and they were going to put, they were investing a certain amount of money to advertise with Arsenal Football Club. And he was so dismissive of this. But what was revealed was someone who did not know anything about the transformation of Africa. Yeah, Africa was still lost in history.
Yeah, well, that's unfortunate. Yu Jie, you have spent so much time in, you have spent so much time here in the UK. What is your impression? You think over the years that people here in the UK have grown more interested in learning about China or finding out about China, or they have pretty much stayed the same?
Well, again, it's not a really straightforward question. I think the reasons are two. The first one is based on ideology, as you said. It's on ideational division. Because at the end of the day, they can consider, oh, if it's a Communist Party, and therefore it must be on this wrong side. And if it's a democracy, it must be on the other side. So that dichotomy between democracy vis-a-vis communism, somehow, that was the really great debate within the academia. And I think the second reason is really this of the human nature of unknown. You don't know a huge country, what's that going to happen? And it's to develop in relation with the country something completely different from, you know, the Western society. I think that really the normal human nature of unknown somehow really put the British public misunderstanding China. Just to give a very quick example, I mean, before the Brexit debate, or even before Brexit referendum, if you're really looking up the coverage on talking about the UK's relation with non-European member states, if you look into the op-ed written by the 4 major broadsheets, you hardly see any discussion to talk about, you know, UK's relation with Japan or UK's relation with many other important East Asia countries as such at all. I think it's not really just about China. I think it's really overall about non-European countries in general. The British public seems somehow lack of knowledge in here.
Yes,
Could I
Vivian,
perhaps
please.
come in there? Because it sometimes is a matter of resources. And I found this out from the work that I was doing, that there was actually a lot of interest in China, but that it's more difficult, the further away you get from the UK, to put the resources into going and getting the stories. And what I found out was that quite often China would be done in sections and in chunks around a summit or some other reason why China would be reported on. But the day-to-day, minute-by-minute things were much less likely to be reported, and China is less likely to be treated as a routine matter of coverage.
But how can that be changed? Do you see something
Money.
Money? Like
Money, resources for reporting, and unfortunately, at the moment in this country, that is going down.
Yeah, but I mean, actually, whether or not you're willing to put the money in depends on how important you think it is.
Do people see the importance?
Ultimately, it's not a financial issue, it's a political issue. Does the BBC or whoever think that instead of, and you accurately describe the situation, China only needs to be covered occasionally according to a big event or an anniversary or something like that? Or is China so important now that it needs to be covered in an ongoing and relatively continuous way? If you turn on any of these programs, I've mentioned the Today program, day after day after day, there's an American item, maybe 2, 3, and nothing on China. You can go for a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks without anything on China. This is such a distortion of what the world is now.
You also get the fact that Carrie Gracie isn't the BBC's China editor anymore for reasons that we won't go into here, but with that has disappeared a lot of the sort of unique coverage and the way of getting beyond the headlines in a way.
Mr. Perry, your take on this?
It's an interesting question. As we were talking, my thoughts went back to the 80s and 90s, 1980s, 1990s, when Japan was being courted to invest in the UK. And there was a lot of resistance to foreign investment at that time, a lot of quirky programs about these strange people coming in and running their businesses in different ways from the British. But you know, we overcame that. And in many ways, the United Kingdom market is much more open than any of the other European markets. And as China comes forward, it's got to make judgment calls now about the relative way it treats Europe and the United Kingdom if they are separated. But overall, I think the Chinese will find it much easier to invest in the UK. And some of the drive for the increased exports from the UK to China will come from Chinese investment in UK companies. So I'm a bit more optimistic than some about the prospects for the UK relationship for the reasons that Martin pointed out. Britain really has little alternative after Brexit other than to develop a major relationship with China.
We have seen this mention or this term, the golden age, right,
Yes.
between China and the UK, and it seems, as Martin, you have said, it seems not to have been sustained, although it is still alive. What is happening to this golden age idea? Is it on the Chinese side or is it on the UK side? Is the current government of the UK interested in maintaining this prospect alive?
Well, I think it's a mutual interest in here. We gather, on the one hand, obviously, the Chinese companies and Chinese government was much hoping the UK could provide a secure investment place for the Chinese companies invested in UK. So, I mean, as you said, UK is the most open market compared with many other Western European countries. And secondly, don't forget what is going on the other side of the Atlantic. So currently, we have this US-China trade dispute. So we have an unreliable state of America in here, dealt with China. And China, of course, were looking for building more partnerships with the countries who are play by rules, play by multilateral rules. And of course, building alliances is something also quite important.
Well, just the other day, Liam Fox was talking about supporting China in this, in promoting trade, in this upholding this rule-based international framework, and yet it seems that the UK government is facing a dilemma in balancing its relationship with China vis-a-vis its relationship with the United States. So in terms of the special relationship between UK and the United States and the potential natural partner between China and the UK, Martin, what is going to be the choice, or what's on the mind of British politicians at this moment?
I think most of them, probably Parliament is relatively backward, I think. in various ways, intellectually, politically, and so on, compared with probably the population at large. I think that at the moment, people are still, by and large, at a political level, thinking, parliamentary level, thinking in the old ways. And but I think that it's, I tried to say this earlier, that the problem is the ground is shifting under our feet. That's what Trump represents. Everything is shifting. That we're no longer standing on stable ground, and so I think that I would definitely not be surprised. I'm not an apocalyptic person generally, but I wouldn't be surprised if we didn't see some very big opinion shifts compared with what we previously experienced. And the reason for that is just the world is, the old world order is crumbling.
Well, some people might say that's just the matter happening at this particular moment. It's family feud, what is happening between the West, between Europe and the United States, whereas what is happening between China and the West is something of a different nature. Yeah, Vivian, have you thought? Do you think about these issues? Do you have an opinion on this? The kind of dilemma, where to look for the UK, West or East, in the future?
I think the UK has to look east if it is so absolutely convinced that it's going to cut itself off from the vast market that's on its doorstep. It's left itself no other choice.
But that's only Europe. What about the United States?
Well, I think Donald Trump has shown how fickle he can be, and how it's not wise to put all your eggs in one basket. That's all I would say on that matter.
You see, I think that you can't think of it quite like you put it. I think that when I say the ground is shifting, it's not just Trump. The really underlying factor is not Trump. The underlying factor is the shift in the centre of gravity of global economic and political power from the West to the East. That is what's changing everything. If you really understand what's happening in America, I think that it is suddenly the realization that China is not what it was and what they thought it was. It is actually a challenge to American hegemony in the world. That's the reasons for that are not simply ideological. They're much more important than that. They're material, they're substantial, they're economic. You can't deny them.
I think it's your opinion, your argument, of course, is a very nice picture, a very rosy prospect for us as Chinese, but I think a lot of people in the West wouldn't agree with that kind of prospect, probably thinking the West is probably going to hold on to quite some time in a dominant situation. Mr. Perry.
I think so. I think we can easily forget how powerful the United States is. It's probably by far and away the most powerful economic force in the world today. And we're looking at the emergence of China, and China's only just beginning to look at how to express that in global terms. So the road isn't going to be a straight one. And if we did try to go down that, we would get ourselves in trouble. And we'd get ourselves strained with the United States, and the United States is not a good country to get on the wrong side of, that's for sure. So the British are going to have to work their way through this over the next 10, 15, 20 years. Yeah. The question is whether they recognize that. As somebody who's lived here all my life and feel very comfortable here, my sense is that British politicians and British business leaders are beginning to realize that that map that Martin showed of BRI is where the future opportunity lies. And in order to deal with that, we can't say just come and use London as the world's financial centre to fund it. We've also got to say we've got to get out there. Yeah. Now the British were good at that, maybe in the wrong ways, 200-300 years ago, but we've got to again find that part of our historical culture of going out, like China, and being part of it. So there's a lot of challenges ahead.
Yeah. You think in terms of the Belt and Road Initiative, do you think it's being discussed enough? People understand this? So again, we're coming back to...
I mean, I think the same is true for people in China. People in China often say to me, you've been studying BRI for the last 5 years, could you tell us about it? So yes, I think the problem about not understanding BRI is about not understanding the biggest infrastructure project ever done in the world, which is transnational. It's not one one country, it's across many countries. It'll reduce the average transportation cost from Europe and Asia, between Europe and Asia by 25%, reduce the time by over 3 weeks of moving goods across. So the transformation of BRI is huge. At the moment, it's confined to an area close to China. China and the BRI will prosper much more if China and the United States can come to terms with each other. That'll be a problem for the Europeans because we'll have stood back, let the Americans fight their battle first. They'll take some of the best opportunities and Europe will come behind it. But we'll do okay. I think the opportunities are vast.
Okay, Yu-Jie, you wanted to
Yeah,
add?
I just want to chip in on this BRI thing. I think it's really a gradual process regarding the perception of China or China try to play an infrastructure building in this case. I mean, last year, the Foreign Affairs Committee of this country launched inquiry on UK-China relations. I was fortunate or unfortunate being one of the expert witnesses on the panel. So we probably spent about 70 minutes with all the most important MPs of this country talking about BRI. So obviously, to begin with at the political elite level, the mindset has begun to change. But on the other hand, I also received some really slightly upsetting numbers regarding how much interest British younger generation towards China. So last year in total, there's about only 300 undergrad, graduate level students doing China studies, which is alarming. I mean, considering how many Chinese students who actually study in here and try to understand Britain. So I think there's some more education work to do among the younger generation in here.
Yeah. Well, in terms of the discussion about the Belt and Road Initiative, what can be done better in terms of the role of the media? I mean, can China do a better job? Can we on CGTN do a better job talking about this? Or can the media here in the UK do a better job if they are interested at all, Vivian? Also drawing lesson from what they did during the Brexit referendum.
Yes, I mean, what actually occurred to me when we were talking about BRI was Africa, because CGTN's coverage of Africa, as I've found out from my things, is very interesting. There's a great sort of stability narrative going through it. You know, are these countries stable? Are they good to invest in? And what I see possibly happening here is maybe China looks at Britain like that. Is Britain stable enough to invest in?
Wow.
Not a bad question.
Not that question.
Yeah. Don't laugh too hard, I think, is
But
because
again,
the country is split down the middle, and you could see that from the referendum. It's not mirrored in the political class, but it is mirrored in the population.
What I really want to draw attention to, focus on as a last point, subtopic of our discussion, is really the media's role. Should the media have done a better job? For instance, the media here in the UK, you were all talking about a very ill-informed vote. What could have been done better? Any experience to share, any lesson that can be drawn? Vivian again.
I think just very, very briefly, listen to the people. That's all.
Yeah, fair, Mr. Mayor.
I think with that, referendums are not a good idea. These are serious subjects. They're not. This turned into a reality TV program, and people voted on immigration and things like that, which were not really crucially relevant to this. Yes, the media has got to do a much better job, but it's difficult for the media to do that, to transform a culture of 50 years into a new way of looking at things, and to talk to an audience that's largely wanting simple, quick pleasures. It's not easy, and we welcome CGTN being here, beginning to open up some explanations of BRI. That's important.
I think it's more to, I mean, I'm speaking from academic point of view. I mean, by being, you know, a person who explains things to the public, I think somehow academics should try to transfer its own knowledge into a public knowledge. I think that is the lack of it during the Brexit debate. Academics have not spoken well enough. I think it's also on the China sector as well. You often hear China bashers or panda huggers. You hardly have any nuanced, neutral voices. I think it's really that sense of neutral voices we needed in that space.
Yeah. Well, Mr. Jacques, if you would have been in the media, what would you have done differently concerning the Brexit? An impossible question.
I think that it's a very big, the roots of the problem are very deep. That basically Britain lost its empire after the end of the Second World War, which was hugely important to us. And we had to establish a new direction. And with various stops and starts, we ended up joining the European common market. It was the European community. But the problem was that Britain was never convinced by it, basically. I mean, I think the problems are very deep. Why wasn't Britain? Britain had never really been a European power in that sense. It's never thought of itself as a continental European power. It thought of itself as an island with global interests, and it intervened occasionally in Europe, but by and large, it wasn't like France or Germany. And it is an island, and it's got an island mentality, you know, just like Japan has in relationship to the Asian continent.
It was a very powerful island where the sun never set.
So I think that. So I don't want to be trite about. You know, I think you can't blame the media for this situation. The media's caught up in it like everyone else, and I think, quite frankly, if I listen when I'm listening, I think the media people are divided themselves. I mean, obviously, if you work for the Daily Mail or the Sun or something like that, that's been, you know, that's ideologically very pro-Brexit. But I think, for example, I think the BBC people are divided in some degree. I think a majority are pro-Remain. So I'm not going to blame the media for the situation. But the result of all this is really a meltdown in our governance capacity. That's the bottom line.
All the very best for the people and the government of the UK to come out of this big melting pot sooner than better. I think we're going to leave it here. Many thanks to our panelists, Mr. Martin Jacques, Dr. Ugie, Mr. Perry, and Vivian Marsh. Thank you so much. So, Mike, what do you think?
Oh, fantastic. I think Lucien needs a big round of applause as well.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
And if you haven't watched The Point, you got an idea of what it's like. It's a lot of thoughtful discussion, and that's really worth pointing out. We have great talk shows. We do The Heat in Washington. You do a great program out of Beijing. We have documentaries. We have feature reporting. We have global news. And, of course, one of our strongest features is our business news. And so when we launch here in London, we're going to launch with Global Business Europe, which is going to join our family of business programming that emanates from Beijing and Nairobi and Washington. We've been at it for a while, and so let's take a look.
Hello and welcome to this Asian edition of Global Business on CGTN, the China Global Television Network. We're coming to you live from Beijing. I'm Cheng Lei. This channel is where I went from finance to journalism 17 years ago. Back then, China was on the cusp. These days, what happens here affects markets around the world. It's that experience that gives me perspective about the inevitable economic cycles and about the reversal of fortunes.
I was one of the first hires here back in 2011. I worked on this from the ground up, and I helped launch the first programming back in the beginning of 2012. Working on a startup is really hard work, but it's very rewarding, especially here. We work with so many professional people from all walks of life, from all backgrounds.
One of the best things about CGTN is our ability to really look at all continents. A lot of underrepresented stories from Latin America, the African continent. We really try and shine a spotlight on the stories that you just don't hear in the Western media. And this is really a work family. I've been here since our first show in 2012, and I've seen us grow in richness of ideas and the development of our team. And from working as a producer to a correspondent to an anchor, you really get to see how the whole team really makes this work. And I think this is why we're also an award-winning network and an award-winning team.
Working in CGTN Africa's business team has broadened my horizons, and it's widened the meaning of African business for me. The daily dynamic mix of stories covering growing financial markets, the expanding business segments, as well as the inspiring examples of innovation across the continent, it makes each day quite exciting. What I love about my job is being in the world's most dynamic economy.
talking to policymakers and the best business minds, seeing the backstories of history being made.
We also have the most English language correspondents of any network in Latin America and in Africa. This is a great opportunity for you to start from the ground up. Again, it's not an easy job, but it's extremely rewarding.
Now, CGTN's business team represents a melting pot of different countries and different cultures that certainly have come together to present unique perspectives on our everyday business topics and events, all on one platform.
We definitely look at entrepreneurs in countries all over the world who are making a difference wherever they are. We look at women in the workforce and how they're impacting the economy, the business of health. We know how important that is, not just to ourselves, but the people who are depending on us. And whether it's tech, education, you name it, we really do make any story a business story because it really is about you. So we really hope that you will join the CGTN family and get your voice heard too.
One of the awards that was mentioned here was the Gracie Award, which has been awarded to excellent women in media since 1975. And I think the female workers in the business team in DC was given that award by the American Alliance for Women in Media for their excellent work. And also, you might have noticed from that video is CGTN is not a state-run television like what many people think, or a lot of Chinese, or mostly Chinese. It's actually a Chinese-run media platform where we have a great diversity of contents and diversity of culture, of nationality, of people like you, Mike.
Oh, yes, that's right.
You were one of the very first people who were hired for the DC Bureau. Why don't you share with us your experience working for CGTN DC ever since?
I'd be delighted to. And of course, when RT was talking about how hard it was, I was there when RT walked in the door.
Okay.
So
let me give you all the spotlight.
I was going to say, I talk for a living, so I may be up here for a little bit. So this is a wise move on your part. Rather than talk about what happened in 2011, I thought we're storytellers. I thought I'd tell a quick story about a journalism experience I went through back in 1993. I was in Baidoa, Somalia. I was in a hospital, and as you know, at that time, it was a country which was gripped by a civil war and famine. So we were in this hospital, very small confines, and a lot of young children that were starving there. And we were profiling some of the doctors and nurses who were caring for these children. And so the photographer was crouching down and trying to get shots. But as I said, it was a tight corner, so I'd somehow be standing in his shot. So he'd have the camera in one arm and his hand going like this. And then, so then I'd move, and then he would move. And then it was this again. And so everywhere I moved in this room, somehow I managed to get in his shot. It was very frustrating. And then I saw a door that was ajar. So I slipped through the door. And I entered one of the patient rooms, and there wasn't really anybody in there except a woman in the far corner, sitting on a bed, clutching her little boy. And that's really not an apt description. It was more if you had seen a skeleton and some dark parchment stretched over it. This little boy was starving to death, and his eyes were so wide. The fear in his eyes, but the fear in the mother's eyes were just as apparent. And as I sat there, it would be so easy to think about what separated us. You know, the color of our skin was different. She lived in a poor country, I lived in a country of plenty, and the list goes on and on. But I didn't think about what separated us. I thought about the connection. Because as she held that boy, I thought about the fact that my boy, back in the United States, was about the same age. And I thought about, what would it be like if the roles were reversed? If I was that woman, living in terror, looking across at the stranger from a strange land, what would I want from him? I'd want him to be a witness to my life. I'd want him to be a voice for the voiceless, to go back and tell a story and perhaps make a difference. So I'll fast forward to today, and I'll stand here where there's a divider, because I'm straddling two worlds right now. I live in a country where the leader talks about building a wall, and a wall separates people. But professionally, I work for a corporation, a company, a broadcast media, CGTN, which is more interested in building bridges, a bridge between the East and the West, between countries, between continents, a bridge of cultures. And I know that we have a number of great correspondents. Some of them are here today. I had a chance to visit with them, Kate Parkinson, Richard Bestick, and I think they share the same values I do. They want to go out and tell those important stories. I have no way of knowing what happened to that woman and that little boy, but I do know that some nights when I'm anchoring the news, I throw to a correspondent by the name of Abdulaziz Bilo, who's in Somalia, telling stories about what's going on in Somalia all these years later. And when I get in my car and I drive home at night, I drive home with the confidence knowing I'm probably the only anchor in Washington, D.C., who threw it to a correspondent in Somalia who's telling those stories, a voice for the voiceless. So Martin talked about, and I wrote down what he said because I want to quote him correctly because that's part of our job. The old world order is crumbling. The ground is shifting. It's not just that diagram that he showed about China. It's about the media as well. Because the media right now is an accordion. You see so many media organizations squeezing and squeezing. Really talented people losing their jobs. But at CGTN, we're going in the other direction. We're here today to talk about launching London. So I'm sure you saw the signs on the way in, see the difference. I would suggest you go one step further. Be the difference. And that's what we're doing right now. And I'm delighted to be a part of CGTN. And it was the best career decision I ever made coming aboard. And I'm thankful that they hired me. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you. It's great. It's great to work with.
It really is family.
Yeah. And I would add one more bridge. I think CGTN is also the bridge of opinions. Different opinions.
Absolutely.
And I'm really grateful as an opinion show host, I'm encouraged to have different opinions on my show so people can debate, can have a fight, can sometimes they are not so nice. But I'm happy that I'm given that tolerance, I'm given that freedom to demonstrate different opinions and people can hear each other and you know, talk about the difficult things we're faced with today. So that is all for this changing landscapes, the media, Brexit, and China. I hope you can take away some things useful for you from today's discussion. If you have any questions, all of us are available, including Mr. Jiang from CGTN. He's the head of all the channels under the umbrella of CGTN.
He's the one you want to get to know.
So please feel free to mingle and find out more about us. Thank you very much.
Thank you.